Shadows behind the spotlight. The glittering cityscape of New York shone outside Grace Evans' penthouse window, flickering with promise and opportunity. Grace, however, had long grown accustomed to the brightness that came with being the wife of Thomas Evans, a rising political star whose face appeared on billboards, television panels, and magazine covers all over the city. To outsiders, Grace's life seemed charmed. She was elegant, well-spoken, and always perfectly poised by Thomas's side at galas, fundraisers, and press events. Yet, behind her carefully curated smile was a woman who felt increasingly invisible within her own marriage. Grace's days were a blur of obligations. School runs for their 8-year-old son, Oliver, charity meetings, and handling endless invitations from New York's elite. But for months now, a growing unease had crept into her routines. Thomas, once attentive and warm, had turned distant. He came home late, often canceling family dinners at the last minute, citing emergency meetings or campaign crises. Their conversations became transactional, revolving around schedules, campaign appearances, or the needs of their son. The warmth, those private jokes, the shared silences over midnight coffee, had faded, replaced by a cold civility. Still, Grace clung to hope, rationalizing his absence as the pressure of an election year. There were always speeches to write, hands to shake, and policies to debate. A politician's life, she told herself, was demanding. But nagging doubts persisted. Sometimes, Thomas's phone would buzz in the middle of the night, his tone sharp and guarded when he answered calls in the next room. Grace forced herself not to snoop, unwilling to betray her own principles. But questions grew heavy in her chest. The distance wasn't just emotional. At public events, Thomas became increasingly performative. His affection seemed staged for cameras, his gaze often scanning the room instead of settling on her. Grace felt herself relegated to the role of politician's wife, expected to smile, nod, and never reveal weakness. The loneliness was suffocating, but she was determined not to let anyone, least of all the city's gossip-hungry press, sense any cracks. At night, Grace found herself wandering through silent halls, replaying memories of their early years. She remembered the passion that drew them together, the shared ambitions, the laughter echoing through their tiny first apartment in Brooklyn. She traced her finger along faded photographs, the young couple radiating hope and certainty, wondering where things had changed. With each passing week, the signs multiplied. She noticed a faint, unfamiliar perfume on Thomas's jacket after one of his late nights, a scent floral and young, so unlike hers. He was quick to offer explanations when pressed, his words practiced and dismissive. "Don't worry, Grace. It's just work. Everything's fine." But the rift between them grew wider, invisible but undeniable. Grace's intuition, always sharp, grew restless. She became hyper-aware of details. The shift in Thomas's cologne, the sudden appearance of expensive gifts tucked away in the closet, the way he avoided her eyes when speaking. She longed to confront him, to demand answers. But fear of shattering the family they had built, and perhaps her own reputation, held her back. For now, she watched and waited, her mind battling between suspicion and self-doubt. Despite the darkness creeping into her private world, Grace refused to let it spill into the public eye. She put on her most dazzling gowns, delivered gracious speeches at charity luncheons, and made sure Oliver never sensed her sorrow. But beneath it all, a storm was gathering. A storm Grace knew she could not ignore forever. And as the city's spotlight shone brighter on Thomas's career, in the quiet shadows of their home, Grace began to question, what price was she willing to pay for the illusion of perfection? And what would she do when the truth finally demanded to be seen? Signs of betrayal. It started with small, almost dismissible clues. A subtle shift in Thomas's habits, changes so minor they might have gone unnoticed had Grace not been on constant alert. The routine she'd built around the rhythms of their marriage slowly unraveled. Thomas's text message tones grew more frequent and insistent, but he would silence his phone or glance at the screen with a frown, then slip away to take the call in the privacy of his home office. One rainy Wednesday afternoon, as Grace gathered the dry cleaning from Thomas's SUV, her eyes fell upon a crumpled receipt from an upscale jewelry store tucked between the seats. There was no anniversary, no upcoming birthday, nothing that required an extravagant, secret gift. Curious, but uneasy, Grace tucked the slip away, her mind racing with possibilities. That evening, Thomas excused himself after dinner, claiming exhaustion from a long day. But Grace noticed his watch, a new, expensive model, one she had never seen before, and one, she would soon realize, bought on the same day as the mystery receipt. Emails, once sometimes open for her to see, were now password protected, his laptop always shut and locked away. When Thomas wasn't working late, he was glued to his phone, typing rapidly with his back turned to her. If she approached, he would minimize the window or set the device face down. The growing number of late-night meetings and abrupt schedule changes became impossible to dismiss with the old explanations. Grace's suspicions grew heavier, morphing into a quiet vigilance. She never considered herself a suspicious person. She valued trust, and her dignity balked at the thought of snooping. But as the discrepancies mounted, she felt driven not by jealousy, but by the need for truth, for clarity in the fog that had settled over her home. One Saturday, while Thomas was away at what he claimed was a working brunch, Grace heard Oliver giggling upstairs. Her son had found Thomas's tablet, left unlocked for once. The home screen revealed only innocuous apps and campaign notes. But Grace's gaze caught an unfamiliar notification, the name Emily, blinking beside a winking emoji. Her pulse racing, she quickly pieced together a thread of recent messages, paired with late-night timestamps and vague plans that did not match the family calendar. The tone of the exchanges was flirtatious, intimate, so out of character for the careful, formal Thomas she thought she knew. Trying to maintain composure, Grace cross-referenced the details she'd seen. Restaurants mentioned, meetings scheduled, and realized many of Thomas's work emergencies coincided with invitations from Emily Carter, a bright and ambitious young aide who had recently moved onto his team. Grace had met her briefly at an event, charming, well-dressed, and eager to please, but never striking her as a threat until now. The evidence was circumstantial, a pattern of missed calls, Emily's name recurring on call logs and email headers, unexplained absences, new clothes, and gifts, but together, they painted a picture that Grace could no longer ignore. The final blow came when, late one night, Thomas returned home reeking of a delicate floral perfume, one that clung to his jacket long after he had showered. Grace, standing in the doorway of their bedroom, asked quietly about it. He smiled, tired and unconvincing, and brushed her concern aside without offering an explanation. That night, long after Thomas fell asleep, Grace sat alone in the darkness, wrestling with fear, humiliation, and anger. She scrolled through old photos of their early days, her finger trembling as she searched for any sign she had missed. A look, a gesture, a shadow behind a smile. Each piece of evidence drove a wedge into her resolve. But instead of breaking her, it began to steel her determination. The truth, ugly as it was, felt less terrifying than the ambiguity that had gripped her for weeks. By the end of that anxious night, Grace had made a decision. The days of passive hope and silent suffering were over. She would become her own investigator and quietly assemble the puzzle. Trust had been broken, but she would not let it rob her of control. Though her heart ached, Grace resolved that whatever happened next, she would meet it with open eyes. And for the first time in months, felt a flicker of strength where there had only been fear. The collapse of trust. On a brittle Monday evening in March, the world Grace Evans had so carefully orchestrated finally began to shatter. The city lights glittered far below her as she stood in the vast, echoing silence of her penthouse living room, every surface immaculate, every piece of furniture carefully chosen to project success and stability. But inside, chaos brewed. She could no longer ignore the mounting evidence, the late nights and secret calls, the unfamiliar perfume, the laughter she sometimes overheard Thomas sharing on the phone with a voice that was not hers. After weeks of internal struggle, of questioning herself and second-guessing every intuition, Grace drew a line. She would demand the truth. The confrontation was less dramatic than she imagined, yet infinitely more devastating. Thomas arrived home well after midnight, the city's pulse dying down outside, exhaustion written on his face. Though, whether genuine or merely a mask, who could say any more? Grace was waiting, perched on the edge of their taupe velvet sofa, brittle composure wrapped tightly around her. "We need to talk," Grace said, her voice steady, belying the panic fluttering in her chest. She watched as Thomas's eyes, once warm and searching, flickered with something unreadable, and then settled into a cold evenness. The man she had loved for more than a decade seemed, for the first time, a stranger. She presented her evidence plainly. No theatrics, no melodrama. The receipts, the late-night meetings that never appeared on the campaign calendar, the coyly worded messages, some of which she had accidentally glimpsed on his phone. She mentioned the floral perfume that lingered on his jacket, far too young and sweet to belong to her or any of their social circle. For a long moment, Thomas was silent, studying her with the wariness of a man calculating the next move in an impossible chess game. When he spoke, his words were rehearsed, not spontaneous. "I owe you honesty," he began, voice carefully modulated. "I think we both know things haven't been right for a while. I didn't want it to end up like this." He admitted, with a vague gesture of regret, that he was seeing someone else. No apology, no explanation of why or how it happened. Just a tired confession, delivered like a press release. Detached, inevitable, a necessary evil for the sake of appearances. The fury Grace had expected never came. Instead, she felt a hollow collapsing inside her. A vacuum left behind by years of unacknowledged distance and eroding trust. She listened, numb, as Thomas spelled out his intentions with chilling clarity. He wanted a divorce, and he wanted it handled quietly. He spoke about media optics, about the importance of keeping the campaign clean, about how the voters can't see any mess. Each phrase felt like a verdict, reducing their marriage to a liability, herself to a threat to his public image. When Thomas declared his intention to pursue full custody of Oliver, their 8-year-old son, Grace recoiled as if struck. "It's better for him," Thomas intoned flatly, spinning lines about stability and the challenges of Grace's emotional state, a narrative more calculated for court filings than for a wounded wife's heart. The implication was unmistakable. He would not hesitate to weaponize his influence, his team of lawyers, his carefully curated public persona, all against the woman who had built her life around him. Within days, her world transformed. Thomas moved out, though his presence lingered everywhere. His suits lined up in the closet, his toothbrush by the sink, his campaign posters in the foyer. His absence was a void that Oliver noticed first. The boy asked after his father, questions Grace struggled to answer. Every morning, Grace constructed a mask for herself, smoothing her features, so Oliver saw only calm, never heartbreak. The legal papers arrived a week later, hand-delivered by a stone-faced courier. They were thick with legalese and demands, full custody for Thomas, restrictions on her access, even constraints on her living arrangements. Thomas's attorneys detailed emotional instability on Grace's part, dissecting her every recent moment of sadness, her withdrawal from social functions, her private tears, and twisting them into weapons. They cited her reduced presence at campaign events as proof of neglect, painting a picture of a woman too fragile to be trusted with a child. Never mind the reality that her pain was caused by the very betrayal she was now being punished for. As the days passed, Grace discovered the onslaught was not just legal, but social and psychological. Friends, whom she and Thomas had entertained for years, stopped returning her calls. Family group chats grew quiet, her presence growing more like an awkward afterthought. Rumors swirled within the social circles she once dominated, whispers of her growing erratic, suggestions that perhaps she'd always hidden a troubled side. Even the press, careful at first, began publishing suggestive headlines, never naming names, but making their meaning clear to those in the know. Thomas Evans, that golden son of New York, was bravely weathering a family crisis. Within the penthouse walls, isolation pressed in. She could not leave without risking run-ins with reporters, and the few charity committee members who dared visit studied her with pity, as though watching a wounded animal. Even her own parents called, softly suggesting that maybe it was for the best, that Thomas might provide Oliver with more stability. The betrayal stung most here, in the silences, in the way people deferred to Thomas's version of events without ever asking for hers. Through it all, Grace's grief transformed from raw pain to a cold, steady resolve. She met with her attorney, a sharp woman recommended by a friend from her university days, and began the painstaking process of fighting back. She gathered the documentation, emails, financial statements, even photographs. Every photograph from recent family events took on new meaning, a chronology of loss she itemized, not just for divorce court, but for her own sense of reality. She realized, to survive this, she would have to challenge the whole infrastructure built to silence her, to render her a footnote in someone else's victory speech. She would have to become her own advocate, her own protector, her son's only shield. Grace found small islands of solace in her new routines. Morning walks in Central Park with Oliver, evenings spent reading or journaling on her terrace. She built a new network, slowly, of people who saw her not as Thomas Evans's wife, but as Grace, a mother and a woman in her own right. She signed on to support groups, attended meetings quietly under an assumed name, and, most important, she began to plan. Not for revenge, not yet, but for justice, for truth-telling, for reclaiming the narrative of her own life. For the first time in many years, Grace allowed herself to dream of a future shaped by her own choices. She decided, sitting in the hush of her penthouse late one night, that she would not only endure this devastating collapse, she would build something new from its ruins. In the brokenness, she found something unbreakable, her will, and somewhere, under the pain and humiliation, a quiet strength took root, one that would grow, and soon enough, blossom into the fierce defiance that would surprise even herself. Quiet scheming. The days after the official separation moved with the weight of heavy clouds, but something had shifted within Grace Evans. The ache of betrayal had dulled, little by little, replaced by a sober clarity. If Thomas's world was governed by strategy and spin, then Grace resolved to become her own strategist, her own protector. For the first time, a faint current of resolve ran beneath each of her movements. She was finished being a spectator in her own downfall. Grace started small. She began journaling every detail she could recall, reconstructing a timeline that might reveal hidden patterns. Late nights, she remembered, unexplained absences, stray receipts, Thomas's changing demeanor. Each recollection took on a new layer of significance when lined up on the page. She cross-referenced to text messages about work dinners with campaign schedules she found on public calendars, noting the discrepancies. The meticulousness calmed her, a way to reclaim her sense of agency. With the penthouse now cold and silent, Grace used her solitude to her advantage. She wandered through the rooms at night, careful not to wake Oliver, and photographed anything out of the ordinary. Forgotten ties with names of businesses she didn't recognize, business cards left wedged in his coat pocket, and slips of paper with scribbled addresses. She collected them all, creating a hidden folder on her laptop, which she password-protected with a phrase only she would know. She paid close attention to their bank accounts and credit card statements. In the past, she would have trusted Thomas to handle their finances, but now she noticed regular withdrawals from ATMs near hotels and restaurants nowhere near their home or office. She looked up the locations, finding more than one linked to reservations under Evans' campaign, but never seeing receipts to match. Every email Thomas had copied her on was re-examined. Every family download from their iCloud reviewed for deleted images and odd timestamps. The anxiety that accompanied these efforts was nearly paralyzing at times. She lived in constant fear that Thomas, or one of his aides, might discover what she was doing. Perhaps even hack her, as she'd seen happen on the news to other political families in turmoil. Grace took every precaution. She stored backup copies on a thumb drive locked in a jewelry box. She never spoke about her efforts to anyone, not even to her attorney at this stage. Knowing how tenuous trust could be in a world built on secrets. Yet Grace also knew she couldn't fight alone. She needed someone on the outside, someone who could see the value in her evidence when the time was right. After a week of research, reading through countless exposés online, she reached out via a secure, encrypted email to Samantha Lewis, an investigative journalist known for pursuing political scandals with ferocity and tact. Samantha's reputation preceded her. She had broken stories that shook City Hall, yet had managed to protect her sources every time. Grace hoped the name Evans would be enough to get her attention. Samantha's response came within 24 hours. The email was brief but encouraging. She agreed to meet for a coffee in a discreet spot in Lower Manhattan, with assurances that everything would remain off the record unless Grace decided otherwise. Grace barely slept the night before. She worried endlessly. What if Samantha was compromised? What if Thomas's staff was watching her moves? But her determination overruled her hesitation. The cafe was tucked inside a nondescript building across from a bookshop, a place chosen for privacy and anonymity. Samantha arrived before Grace, dressed simply, her face both open and alert. She shook Grace's hand firmly, then listened in silence as Grace laid out the broad strokes of her story, enough to establish credibility, but not so much that she put everything at risk. Samantha asked careful, pointed questions, never once writing anything down, and reassured her that whatever decision Grace made next was hers alone. "Bring everything you find when you're ready," Samantha said quietly. "You need to make sure you're safe first, but I promise I'll help you if you want the truth to come out." Leaving the meeting, Grace felt both lighter and more laden. She had taken the crucial first step from victim to architect. At home that night, she redoubled her efforts. She placed a small voice recorder in the living room, in case she could capture any calls or conversations when Thomas stopped by to see Oliver. She braced herself to record interactions with his aides and legal team, should any evidence of coercion or threats surface. All of it went into her encrypted folders. She also turned her attention to social networks and news archives, screenshotting any statements, tweets, or photos of Thomas and his inner circle that contradicted the family man image his team so zealously maintained. Some nights, exhaustion overwhelmed her, tears returning as she realized how thoroughly she'd been erased from the narrative. But each time doubt crept in, Grace remembered Samantha's words. "You're not powerless. You know the truth." Amid these clandestine efforts, Grace took careful measures to insulate Oliver from the unfolding drama. She read bedtime stories with extra warmth, made pancakes on weekends, and never allowed her sadness to spill into their conversations. On nights when the loneliness was unbearable, she would watch Oliver sleep, vowing that whatever storm was coming, she would shield him from the worst. As her evidence grew, Grace expanded her strategy. She documented gifts Thomas had given her, noting when they doubled as alibis for time spent elsewhere. She tracked his published speaking engagements, comparing his social media geotags with hotel bookings and flights logged on their travel app. She even called a few high-end restaurants under a different name, confirming that Thomas had dined in private rooms with a party of two when the campaign calendar claimed he was elsewhere. Every piece of information was vetted and time-stamped, a web of corroborating details that would be difficult for any PR team to spin away. The more she uncovered, the more her fear made room for something else, an emerging sense of control. Her skills, long dormant under the weight of Thomas's shadow, came alive once more. In another life, perhaps she would have been in Samantha's place, exposing the powerful. By the end of March, Grace had compiled a dossier that told a story Thomas could no longer bury. It was not just about infidelity. It was about hypocrisy, about the abuse of public trust, about the weaponization of power to silence dissent and erase history. She rehearsed what she would say to Samantha when the time came.
I understand you've been having
coaching
some trouble
herself
adjusting.
to stay
Yes, Mr.
calm,
Grant, I have.
to trust in the process she had set in motion.
We're seeing small
Sometimes
wins, and that's
she
good.
allowed herself to
We'll take any
imagine
small win
the
if it's a win.
relief
I
that
know,
would come
right?
when the truth broke at last.
It has to be that
Not
way.
only relief
Otherwise, the
for
entire
herself,
system will be compromised,
but for
and it will
every
not
woman
work.
forced into the shadows by the stories men like Thomas shaped for the world. And so, as the first shock of betrayal faded into focused resolve, Grace knew she had crossed a threshold. She was no longer waiting for rescue, nor was she seeking retribution for its own sake. She was building something, a foundation for honesty, for her son's future, ultimately, for her own sense of self. The plan was no longer just about survival. It was about reclaiming her power and the narrative itself, turning quiet scheming into the opening movement of something braver and entirely her own. Trapped between ambition and truth, the storm Grace Evans had sensed brewing for months, finally thundered into the open. But its violence was unlike anything she had prepared for. Thomas, once so careful about perception, launched a hasty and aggressive media offensive. Tabloid reports and political gossip blogs were soon awash with leaks from undisclosed sources, casting Grace as a cold, unstable spouse, a liability Thomas had endured for the sake of their image and child. Carefully staged photos of Thomas and Oliver, smiling at campaign events and park outings, began surfacing everywhere. In contrast, any image of Grace was chosen to portray her looking distraught or isolated.
Understood.
The damage was swift and surgical. In the upper echelons of New York society, silence spread like a disease. Grace found herself removed from charity committees she'd helped found, her name quietly omitted from benefit invitations. Friends she'd laughed with at countless galas now barely returned her texts. A cold awkwardness filled her phone calls with family, a tone that suggested suspicion, or perhaps exhaustion, with drama they feared would stain their own reputations. Even relatives offered her only measured, cautious sympathy. Maybe Thomas is just under a lot of stress right now, her mother offered gently, as though a little understanding might remedy years of deception and erosion. But it was the weaponization of love, specifically Thomas's love for Oliver, that hurt Grace the most. Thomas's team seeded stories about a father heroically protecting his child through hard times. Oliver's teachers began to treat Grace with a kind of polite concern, quietly asking if there was anything they could do during this time of transition. Some neighbors stopped asking about Thomas altogether. Others avoided eye contact when they passed Grace in the building lobby. Grace's world, once so vibrant and interconnected, calcified into a brittle, lonely routine. She became used to whispering at grocery stores, to the sting of reading her own life story refracted into unrecognizability by anonymous internet commenters. Her first instinct had been to retreat, shield Oliver from the headlines, wall herself off in their penthouse, hoping the storm might pass. But that storm only intensified. The more she withdrew, the deeper the claws of rumor reached into her life. Every hint of seclusion became further proof of her fragility. Every tear spun into evidence of her risk to Oliver's well-being. Amid this siege, Samantha Lewis, the journalist Grace had quietly befriended, became her lifeline. Their clandestine meetings in quiet cafes continued, but their conversations grew more urgent. Samantha showed Grace how Thomas's media machine operated, laying out timelines, identifying planted stories, and insider leaks. "You're up against a whole apparatus built for this," Samantha warned, her voice soft but unwavering. They're going to try to erase your reality and replace it with their version. But we can fight back if we're smart. Despite the mounting evidence she held, Grace hesitated. She worried about the toll that exposing Thomas would take on Oliver, and whether she could withstand the tidal wave of backlash, sure to come when someone challenged a rising political figure. She was haunted by guilt. Was she sabotaging her child's future by fighting for her own truth? Sometimes, late at night, she stumbled on old photos of Thomas and Oliver together, a pang of nostalgia threatening to drown her resolve. Adding to her turmoil, Grace questioned her own actions. Was she truly noble in seeking justice, or simply acting from anger? Did the impulse to reveal Thomas's façade stem from a higher principle or simple retaliation? She worried about becoming exactly what Thomas's team claimed. A woman so obsessed with vindication, she'd burn everything down to get it. In quieter moments, Grace mourned not only her marriage, but the woman she used to be, unburdened by calculation, harassment, and fear. But there were glimmers of support in unexpected places. A handful of old friends reached out, quietly expressing faith in her character, promising to stand by her no matter what the headlines said. Women from her support group, many of whom had faced their own public humiliations, bolstered her with advice and solidarity. Even Oliver, in his innocent way, became a source of courage. His laughter after bedtime stories, his joy at small pleasures, reminded Grace of what was truly at stake. The pressure from Thomas's camp was relentless and grew increasingly manipulative. He offered what he called compromises, more generous financial settlements, a place for Grace in a foundation he planned to establish, provided she signed non-disclosure agreements and publicly supported his campaign. He dangled the illusion of stability, hoping to wear her down before she acted. The calls from his attorneys became more pointed. This can go quietly, Grace, or it can drag on and harm everyone involved. Every time she wavered, Grace returned to the folder of evidence she'd assembled, the hotel receipts, the voice recordings, the messages revealing not only Thomas's affair, but misuse of campaign funds and manipulation of public narrative. With Samantha's encouragement, she began to shape these into a timeline so damning, even the most polished PR spin couldn't erase it. A plan began to take form, a careful release of key proof to trusted reporters. Time to expose the hypocrisy at the heart of Thomas's political persona. At the same time, Grace strengthened her own legal defenses. Her attorney filed motions to challenge Thomas's narrative, built a countercase documenting Grace's role as Oliver's primary caregiver, and gathered testimony from teachers, friends, and staff. Step by step, she clawed back agency from the tide of public opinion. Despite the fear, humiliation, and constant temptation to surrender, Grace became increasingly clear-eyed as the days wore on. She realized that the real struggle was more than a marital dispute or a custody battle. It was a contest between greed and integrity, between the machinery of ambition and the raw resilience of truth. She resolved, whatever the personal cost, not to let Thomas dictate her legacy or Oliver's future. The risks were staggering, but the alternative, living forever in the cage Thomas had built for her, was worse. As April bled into May, and the city outside bloomed with spring's false promise, Grace felt herself harden into something enduring. She dressed for the world each morning, not as the dutiful politician's wife, but as a mother and a woman determined to reclaim her voice. Quiet courage, she discovered, was not about unfeeling strength, but the capacity to move forward while brokenhearted, to face loneliness, and still choose what was right. The coming months, she knew, would bring war, not just for the custody of her son, but for the truth itself. Yet in the mirror, she glimpsed a woman remade, not the casualty Thomas had tried to create, but the author of her own redemption. The first retaliation. It happened quietly, almost imperceptibly at first. The initial ripple of a story too carefully placed to be coincidence. Early one Monday morning, as the city moved to its usual pulse, Grace sat at her kitchen table with a mug of untouched coffee and her laptop open, heart pounding beneath a mask of calm. She watched as Samantha Lewis's article appeared on the homepage of a respected, if not mainstream, online news outlet, a piece meticulously sourced and cautiously worded, raising ethical questions about the blurred lines between family, politics, and the public trust around rising star Thomas Evans. There were no names in the headlines yet, no salacious language, no reckless accusations. But within the 3,000-word piece, Samantha subtly brought forward the mounting evidence of not only Thomas's infidelity, but also possible misappropriation of campaign funds. She referenced unexplained expense accounts, conflicting travel records, and the sudden promotion of a young campaign aide. There, in one damning sentence, was the seed. Voters, sources suggest, may soon ask whether personal and political ambition can ever be truly separated, or whether the cost is paid behind closed doors by those meant to be protected. It was a masterstroke, defensible by fact, impossible to read without understanding its target. The reaction was immediate. Within hours, political blogs and social media personalities began dissecting every word, speculating about the anonymous wife and the implications for Thomas's pristine brand. Talk shows picked it up. Hashtags started trending. People who had not uttered Grace's name in weeks now sent cautious texts or left lingering voicemails, unsure what to believe. Some worried for her, others simply sought the thrill of proximity to scandal. For Grace, the emotions were a dangerous cocktail. Relief that her voice was finally entering the public conversation. Terror that she would be exposed and crushed before the full truth had its day. She sat through the afternoon at her kitchen window as reporters clustered downstairs near the doorman, their lenses trained on the front entrance. Samantha called twice that day, her tone sober but supportive. "This is only the beginning," she reassured Grace. "There'll be blowback, but that means they're scared. Don't respond to anyone. We control the next move." Sure enough, Thomas's response came swiftly and without subtlety. That evening, a lawyer representing him made a statement on live television denying every allegation. "Mr. Evans has always put his family and the public good first," the statement rang out, "and he will not be distracted by groundless rumors designed to distract voters from the issues." Thomas posted photos with Oliver on his campaign's social feed, the two of them tossing a baseball in Central Park. Thomas's smile dazzling, Oliver's unwitting innocence weaponized once again. Comments poured in. "Stay strong, Thomas. Keep fighting for your family," while a darker undercurrent of anonymous accounts began to smear Grace's character online. Thomas's crisis management team swung into full gear, contacting friendly journalists and quietly offering background corrections. Whispers emerged that the real story was about a jealous, fragile wife unable to accept the pressures of public life. Within 24 hours, an anonymous source, in all likelihood Thomas's own legal team, leaked grainy security footage from a charity gala, showing Grace exiting early with a pained expression. Headlines appeared: Evan's marriage on the rocks. Our political wives cut out for the spotlight? Every public appearance Grace had made in the previous year was combed for moments of visible stress or fatigue, each human flaw twisted into proof of instability. The assault did not stop with words. Her email was hacked. Paparazzi waited by the playground each afternoon. Grace's cell phone lit up with calls from unknown numbers, some simply empty silence, others with crude warnings to stay out of politics and think about your child. One morning, she found a note taped to her apartment door. Some things are better left private. For Oliver's sake, drop it. Grace's lawyer filed a harassment report, but the authorities could do little. Meanwhile, the first wave of Samantha's evidence, financial records hinting at campaign finance violations, and testimony from former staff, began gaining traction among investigative reporters with little to lose. Quietly, other political figures distanced themselves from Thomas. Invitations to high-profile dinners evaporated. Sponsorship commitments wavered. Painfully, even some of Grace's former friends recoiled. "Don't make this harder on yourself," one whispered during a brief grocery store encounter, desperate to end the interaction before snapping cameras caught them together. Grace realized she had become radioactive, the symbol of scandal in a world that permitted it, so long as everyone smiled through the damage. Still, Grace pressed on. She worked with Samantha to verify every detail, refusing to be baited into rash interviews or emotional rebuttals. Instead, she quietly gathered secondhand accounts from other campaign insiders willing to talk once the door had cracked open. One brought her a folder of emails revealing direct pressure from Thomas to reallocate campaign donations for personal emergencies. Another handed over a security logbook documenting Thomas's late-night visits with Emily in hotel suites booked through shell companies. With each new fragment of evidence, Grace felt herself reclaiming a sense of agency. The barrage of public humiliation hurt, certainly, but with every truth she documented, courage took root in her chest. Her relationship with Oliver became her lifeline, a source of warmth at the end of each vicious day. She shielded him as best she could, teaching him to focus on his homework and friends, building new family rituals to distract from the world outside. Late at night, Grace sometimes lay awake counting the risks, fearful not so much for herself as for the possibility that her quest for truth might ultimately harm her son. Yet, as she confided again to Samantha, she knew that to yield now would leave Oliver with a legacy of silence and erasure. "The real danger," Samantha assured her, "is letting them make you invisible. That's what keeps things like this happening." As the week ended, the city buzzed with speculation. Would Thomas weather the storm, or would the pressure reveal deeper fault lines? For the first time since her marriage began to fray, Grace allowed herself to hope. She began to imagine a future where dignity and justice, not whispered lies, would shape her story. The first retaliation had been delivered, and the battle lines were now unmistakable. Grace understood that survival depended not on brute force or louder voices, but on patience, clarity, and the power of truth, deployed one carefully placed fact at a time. For the first time, she truly believed she could win, not just for herself, but for every woman kept in the shadows by someone else's ambition. Climax. The truth unveiled. The city felt charged. as if electricity danced in the spring air. Every morning, the headlines twisted and crackled with speculation, anonymous sources, and rumor. But as April ripened into May, Grace's resolve only sharpened. She knew the time had come to move from defense to action, to transform her pain and evidence into one tidal wave of truth, the kind that could not be spun away or quietly buried. She and Samantha met for breakfast at a small cafe, huddled over black coffee and oatmeal, while clocks ticked and the world churned on. Outside, Grace handed over copies of everything she had: voice recordings of Thomas's pressured campaign staffers, receipts showing campaign funds diverted to extravagant gifts, and hotel bookings for Emily, and correspondence that laid bare the manufactured cover story. There were even glimpses of falsified records, signatures that matched neither Thomas's nor campaign accountants, payment authorizations that lined up with Thomas's disappearing nights. Samantha's eyes widened. He manufactured everything, even the records? Emily's promotion, Grace said quietly. The funding for her so-called consultant projects. They were all a cover. There was never a project, just hotel rooms and gifts. Samantha nodded, already compiling her mental structure for the report. You understand what this means, Grace? For him, for you, for the whole campaign? Grace hesitated, feeling the weight of the decision in her bones, then nodded. I'm ready. He wanted to erase me, to erase this. I want my reality in the world, even with all the risk. The explosion. Samantha worked quickly and with precision. She consulted with her outlet's legal team, vetting the documents and the process for any holes. They corroborated Grace's files with campaign workers willing to speak only off the record. Tension simmered in the newsroom and in Grace's heart, the anticipation before a leap off a cliff. When, on a cloud-heavy Thursday afternoon, the report finally went live, the city seemed to collectively hold its breath. The story was not dramatic or theatrical. It was devastatingly precise.
Clumsy.
Samantha and her team detailed how Thomas Evans systematically abused public trust, funneled donations and funds for personal affairs, and orchestrated an ongoing moral and financial fraud, all while selling his model family persona to voters. No detail was spared. Scans of forged documents, audio of Thomas dismissing campaign rules, texts arranging hotel meetings with Emily under coded phrases. There was even a voice memo in which Emily herself, clearly shaken, acknowledged being helped to lie on internal paperwork. The exposé was joined on the site by a 3-minute video statement from Grace. Her face was tired, her voice calm, her words direct. For years, I have done my best to protect my child, my family, and my own dignity. But I realized that protecting silence meant abandoning honesty and letting my son grow up in a world where his mother's reality was erased. Today, I choose truth for myself and for every woman who has ever been silenced by someone else's power. The aftershock, the fallout was immediate and seismic. Within hours, the major dailies picked up the story. Cable news lined up panels dissecting the scandal, fact-checking the receipts, and the voice memos. Social media erupted. Hashtags linked Thomas Evans's name to corruption and hypocrisy. Meanwhile, Grace's video made the rounds, with some expressing disbelief and others rallying to her candid courage. Petitions began circulating, to launch an official inquiry into Thomas's finances.
Rough week, huh?
The district attorney announced a review into potential criminal charges. Campaign headquarters, stunned, went silent. Then suddenly, in a frantic attempt at damage control, released a hurried, poorly ghostwritten apology. Thomas denied criminal intent, but admitted to lapses in judgment, blaming the stress of public life and the toll on his family. He apologized if anyone was hurt, but his cold nonchalance backfired. Those who'd rooted for his wholesome image now felt betrayed. Emily, too, could no longer hide. Only 2 days after the exposé broke, she reached out to Grace through Samantha, asking for a private meeting. In a quiet restaurant booth, she faced Grace with trembling hands and tears in her eyes. "I never wanted to hurt you," Emily whispered.
There's something off
He
about
said
this.
it would only be temporary, that he'd take care of everything. Grace listened, exhausted, but steady. For the first time, she felt pity for this young woman lured and manipulated by the same machinery that had nearly crushed her. Emily agreed to provide a formal statement to investigators, further corroborating Thomas's financial and ethical misconduct. The balance of power shifted overnight. Sponsors and donors pulled their support from Thomas's campaign, publicly denouncing his behavior. Several longtime allies resigned. The district attorney's office subpoenaed both Thomas and his chief of staff. Grace watched the news with detached numbness one morning as a search warrant was executed on the Evans campaign's Midtown office. Campaign files, desktop hard drives, and expense logs loaded into evidence crates. Grace's transformation. Through it all, Grace felt a strange equilibrium, a mix of relief, heartbreak, and purpose. Colleagues and old acquaintances reached out, some to apologize for doubting her, some to share their own stories of being silenced by powerful men. Messages poured in from women, some anonymous, some not, thanking her for her strength and willingness to stand in the line of fire. Grace began attending support groups, not just for herself, but as a speaker, encouraging others to break the cycles of silence and shame. She kept Oliver out of the spotlight as much as possible, refusing any offers for joint interviews or reality TV proposals floated by opportunistic media producers. Instead, she focused on bringing structure and warmth back to their daily life. Weeknight dinners, library visits, weekend soccer games. She let Oliver see her cry sometimes, but she showed him, too, that tears did not mean defeat. A new public gaze. As Thomas's legal troubles deepened, Grace found herself the subject of a new kind of public gaze. Out on errands, strangers stopped her to offer support. A single mother at the grocery store, a bus driver who smiled and said, "We're rooting for you." Nor was the attention always comfortable. Not all believed her, and some blamed her for Thomas's fall. But this time, she refused to let shame dictate her steps. Grace wore her vulnerability as armor. She met the world on her own terms, no longer hiding behind curated perfection. Through each transformative day, Grace stayed in close contact with Samantha. Their bond deepened. Samantha, too, had been attacked and threatened for her reporting, and the two shared war stories and moments of laughter in the trenches of public scrutiny. Grace sometimes wondered aloud if standing up for truth was worth the cost. Samantha always replied, "If we don't, who will?" The aftermath and the beginning, when the district attorney announced formal charges against Thomas Evans for fraud and misuse of campaign funds. Grace did not celebrate. She simply gathered her son and
Thank
walked
Thank you.
with deliberate calm through Central
See,
Park,
I keep a log.
breathing in the soft promise of late spring. She was not the same woman who had once feared the shadows of her penthouse. The truth had not set her free from sadness, but it had finally set her free from erasure. For Grace,
Safe now.
the climax was not just the destruction of a lie, but the forging of a new resolve to live
How are you
openly
feeling, Emily?
and to
Just a
rebuild
little bump.
one truthful day at a time. Standing tall with pride, the news cycle spun relentlessly on, but for the first time in months, Grace Evans felt unburdened by its noise.
So the
Her
temporary
victory
restraining
over
order is
Thomas
something that the
Evans
police will go
and the
ahead
machinery that had almost silenced her did not arrive with fireworks or celebration. Instead, it revealed itself in
file. I heard
quiet
she was charged with
moments,
fraud.
the hush of dawn as sunlight spilled across Oliver's face, the gentle laughter echoing in their home as routine and normalcy returned. The media tornado raged outside, but inside, Grace cultivated space for healing and hope. The court's decision was clear. After weeks of tense hearings, closed-door negotiations, and testimonies from teachers and therapists, the judge awarded Grace primary custody of Oliver. The official ruling cited Thomas's pattern of questionable ethical conduct, ongoing efforts to manipulate public perception, and campaign schedule not reflecting the best interests of the child. For Grace, the legal triumph was less about defeating Thomas than protecting her son from the same machinery of ambition that had tried to swallow her. When the news reached her, delivered in a quietly worded phone call from her attorney, she simply exhaled, closing her eyes as a wave of gratitude and weariness swept over her. Public sentiment shifted quickly in Grace's favor.
Back, I heard.
It wasn't just her testimony or the mountain of documents
why.
she had brought forth. It was the authenticity in her tears, the measured grace in her statements, and her refusal to descend into acrimony. She became a symbol to many, a woman not only surviving betrayal and public shaming, but doing so without sacrificing her dignity or her son's peace. Letters
your
and
name for the
emails flooded in.
Emily Davison.
Some were from strangers who had watched the
so good
saga
to be here with
unfold
all of
on
you.
television. Others from women who shared stories of their own struggles with invisible abuse and public erasure. It was during these days of private relief and public attention that Samantha Lewis approached Grace with an idea. The two met at a cafe, now a more public one. Their meetings no longer shrouded in secrecy or fear. Gone were the furtive glances or whispered exchanges. Instead, Samantha greeted Grace as a colleague, even a friend. "I want to do something more lasting," Samantha said, sliding a crisp folder across the table. "We could work together, not just on your story, but on giving voice to women who don't usually get a platform. You have authenticity, and people listen to you now." Grace turned the idea over in her mind, a speaking tour perhaps, or a foundation for advocacy and legal support. Something inside her that once recoiled from the spotlight now leaned forward. She thought of Oliver, how she wanted him to grow up seeing his mother as a model of courage, not just a casualty of gossip columns. More than that, she realized, she wanted to create change. For so long, she had let fear shape her life. Now, bit by bit, she felt pride taking root where only anxiety had grown before. Oliver adjusted to their new life with the resilient spirit of a child, finally free from tension he could never entirely name. Gone were the days of careful quiet at the dinner table, or wary glances as his parents fought behind closed doors. Grace ensured that his days brimmed with color, trips to the Science Museum, Afternoons at the park, lazy evenings on the couch with popcorn and old Disney movies. Sometimes he asked about his father, and Grace met him with honesty, never bitterness, but never hiding the truth. Your father is figuring out his own path, she'd say, holding Oliver close. Whatever happens, you and I will stay true to ourselves and to each other. As her story became a clarion call, invitations arrived from women's networks, universities, and even national television. Grace, once content to be merely the politician's wife, found her voice on stages and in interview chairs. At first, she spoke haltingly, her confidence raw and new. But the more she spoke, the steadier her footing became. She told audiences about the insidiousness of gaslighting, the psychological violence of image management, and the loneliness of being rendered invisible in the midst of power's glare. She never painted herself only as a victim, nor did she cast Thomas simply as a villain. The real antagonist, she said, was silence. The cultural imperative to keep up appearances, to swallow pain so others might remain comfortable. Her partnership with Samantha flourished. Together, they crafted workshops, online resources, and advocacy programs for women trapped in cycles of coercion or public scrutiny. They traveled to cities far removed from York's bright lights, holding forums where women could share stories in safety. Sometimes, late at night in a hotel lobby after an event, Grace and Samantha would talk about the strange, twin weights of notoriety and hope, how victories won in courtrooms and newsrooms so often felt bittersweet and incomplete. Still, not every day shimmered with easy satisfaction. There were mornings when Grace awoke with the old knots of anxiety in her chest. Nights when the headlines, even in Thomas's absence, loomed over her like spectral shadows. In some circles, she was quietly blamed for Thomas's downfall, labeled cold or ambitious, a cautionary tale, or a difficult woman. But Grace had learned that no life, no matter how valiantly lived, could please everyone. The lesson, she realized, was to claim her own truth, to let pride be a shield rather than a shackle. One crisp morning, as she walked Oliver to school, Grace paused beneath a row of cherry blossoms in full bloom. The city was waking up. Horns, laughter, fragments of 1,000 stories drifting through the air. Oliver squeezed her hand, and Grace knelt to look him in the eye. "Are you proud of me?" she asked, half joking, half in earnest. Oliver grinned, gap-toothed and earnest. "I'm more than proud. You're my hero." The simple words, uncalculated and pure, struck deeper than any headline or round of applause. Numerous women began reaching out to Grace, not only those in situations like hers, but young women searching for a sense of self in a chaotic world. She responded as best she could, sometimes with lengthy replies, sometimes with simple encouragement. You're allowed to take up space. You don't need to apologize for surviving. These were words she'd once struggled to believe herself, but now understood at her core. The final days of spring brimmed with possibility. Grace moved through the city, both more visible and more at peace, no longer shrinking from the gazes of others, but standing tall, head lifted high, laughter steady in her voice. She knew that Thomas, meanwhile, faced ongoing investigations and growing public scorn, a necessary reckoning, she believed, but no longer her concern to manage or mourn. On an evening washed gold by the setting sun, Grace stood at her living room window. Oliver playing quietly nearby, and let her reflection linger in the glass. A woman transformed not by victory alone, but by the dignity she reclaimed and the community she inspired. Whatever storms the future held, she would meet them standing tall. Her story, once an emblem of scandal, was now a beacon for truth, compassion, and unyielding pride, a foundation on which she would help build a braver, kinder world. Consequences and values, the aftermath of the scandal radiated in widening circles throughout New York and far beyond, reaching every sphere that Thomas Evans had once ruled with charm and calculation. The city's old guard, who had once welcomed Thomas at every glittering fundraiser and exclusive rooftop party, now kept their distance. Invitations dried up. Behind closed doors, former allies muttered apologies for their past enthusiasm. What had once seemed like a promising ascent now looked to everyone like an iconic fall from grace. Thomas found himself suddenly, painfully isolated. The campaign office that had once buzzed with a tireless team was now stripped bare. Staffers quit, sponsors withdrew, and the phones stopped ringing. Former supporters gave vague statements or refused to comment at all. A handful of stubborn loyalists offered defiant words to the press, but their voices faded quickly amid a chorus of denunciation and disappointment. Thomas's image in newspapers and on television had changed almost overnight. Gone was the gleaming smile, replaced now by photos of a weary, drawn man dodging questions outside the courthouse or disappearing behind tinted glass. The legal consequences were swift. A grand jury was convened and formal charges filed: fraud, misappropriation of donor funds, and obstruction of justice chief among them. District attorneys reviewed every inch of Thomas's financial trail, and forensic accountants picked apart claims that had once passed unquestioned. For a time, Grace followed the proceedings only as much as was necessary. She refused to let the endless commentary and rumor drag her back into the shadows. The rulings, the headlines, and the editorials could no longer define her world. For Oliver, the consequences emerged in gentler, more confusing ways. He struggled to understand why people at school sometimes whispered when he passed, or why his father could no longer make it to soccer games. Grace met each of his questions with honesty. Some mistakes have big consequences, sweetheart, but one mistake doesn't have to define who we are. All we can do is learn and try to do better. It was a lesson she repeated often, not just for her son, but as a mantra for herself as well. The deeper impact lived outside the courtroom, in the news cycle. Grace understood intuitively that her family's ordeal was only one example of a much larger pattern. In the months following her public stand, she received countless messages, some from women whose circumstances painfully echoed her own, some from people struggling with truths they feared to reveal. Grace became, almost against her will at first, a touchstone for survivors, not only of public shaming, but of the more insidious, private erasures that so often haunted relationships marked by power and secrecy. It was a new kind of challenge, one far removed from courtrooms or press conferences. Grace volunteered at shelters and spoke at small-town libraries, offering her testimony in intimate circles where pain was worn quietly rather than broadcast as news. She guided women in assembling documentation, in finding safe legal support, and in simply having the courage to trust their own stories. With Samantha's ongoing help, Grace launched a modest foundation, a place offering legal aid, workshops on digital security and financial literacy, and trauma-informed peer counseling. Her efforts were not always greeted with universal praise. Some accused her of exploiting her ordeal for notoriety. A few, still loyal to Thomas, or invested in the politics of respectability, painted her as a homewrecker for having gone public at all. But Grace stood her ground, responding with a calm dignity that underscored rather than diminished her message. Each time she addressed a room or responded to a letter, she pointed to the larger values at stake: honesty, mutual respect, the right to recognition, and safety in one's own life. Meanwhile, Thomas's journey unfolded in a quieter, more troubled register. No longer surrounded by devotees, he struggled to adapt to a world that refused to bend for his charisma. Alone in a rented apartment downtown, cut off from the glass towers and box seats he'd once taken for granted, he began to face his own reckoning. Conversations with Oliver, now court-supervised and brief, forced him to look inward for perhaps the first time since he was a boy. He apologized to his son, not with grand gestures, but with soft, stumbling words. Whether redemption would ever be possible remained unknown. But the process had begun, slow and faltering as it was. From a distance, Grace felt sorrow rather than bitterness. She had once loved the person Thomas pretended to be, and now she grieved not just the marriage they'd lost, but the humanity he almost sacrificed to ambition. Her heart ached for Oliver as he navigated questions of loyalty and confusion, but Grace held tight to her values, anchoring her son with rituals rooted in empathy, honesty, and pride. Her support network deepened. Women she met at meetings called her on the hardest nights. Samantha became more like family than friend.
We'll be in the clear.
Grace let herself grieve when she needed to, but also embraced ordinary joys again. Making pancakes for Oliver on Sundays, laughing at their dog's silly antics in the park, planting flowers on her windowsill. She taught Oliver to recognize the value of small victories. Finishing a hard book, apologizing when he made a mistake, helping a friend at school. Sometimes, Grace wondered if her life would ever feel whole again. But in moments of stillness, curled up with Oliver as rain pattered on the windows, or speaking to a room full of strangers and seeing understanding in their eyes, she recognized a wholeness born not from perfection, but from the resilience to survive, heal, and help others do the same. As the months passed, Grace's story shifted in public memory. No longer was she simply the politician's wife at the center of a scandal. Instead, she came to represent something larger: the enduring value of truth, the transformative power of courage, and the belief that even in the wake of devastation, new meaning could be drawn from the rubble. It was not a return to the innocence that preceded her trauma, but the emergence of a richer, deeper self, one forged in struggle, defined by principle, and shared freely with others. For Grace, the greatest consequence was the rediscovery of her own inherent worth, not as an extension of anyone else's story, but as the author of her own, where once she had measured her value in others' approval, she now found it in honest laughter, mindful presence, and the unshakable bonds she shared with her son and her community. And for every woman still trapped in silence, every child confused by the faults of their parents, and every person haunted by invisible wounds, Grace's journey became proof that the consequences of truth, though difficult,
We need to move fast on
were
this.
always more valuable than
Agreed.
the
The
rewards
new evidence
of
changes
deceit.
everything.
A new dawn sunrise spilled golden
This
light
officially puts
across
them
the
on
Manhattan
notice.
skyline, infusing Grace Evans's home with warmth that felt different than it ever had before. It was not simply the turning of a season. It was a subtle, profound shift
Good
within her
morning.
own heart. Gone was the ever-present anxiety that had clung to her for months.
I am
In
having
its
trouble
place,
understanding this data.
a cautious hope took root,
We blocked
quietly
multiple suspicious
resilient,
withdrawals.
stretching towards the future.
We will
She
flag
stood
any
at the
further title
window,
changes for fraud.
watching the city stir awake far below. The incessant clatter of cabs, the shout of vendors, the hurrying feet of New Yorkers. These ordinary sounds felt new, alive with promise. Oliver's soft footsteps padded across the hardwood. He slid his small hand into hers.
Of course, dear.
Together, they watched the world bloom, side by side. For Grace, rebuilding was neither sudden nor linear. There were days when her spirit surged, planning, making lists, tackling forgotten projects with determination. Other times, fatigue washed over her,
Morning.
grief catching her by surprise in the form of an old photograph or an unexpected song on the radio. But through the gentle rhythms of her new life, something unbreakable took hold. The certainty that both she and Oliver were writing a fresh chapter, one entirely their own. Their home felt transformed. Where once its rooms echoed with tension, carefully polite words, the chilling silence of avoidance. Now laughter and conversation filled the air. Grace hung Oliver's drawings on the refrigerator. She baked muffins with him on Sunday mornings, guiding his hands through the messy process, not caring about flour on the counter. Evenings often found them curled on the couch,
How do you feel about
reading
the situation,
or
Jessica?
simply listening to the hum of the city. There was freedom in this simplicity. No more tiptoeing, no more pretending. The media attention faded, replaced by an everyday serenity that Grace relished. More important than anyone else's headlines were the small victories. Oliver's progress at school,
Change all the locks
his
on
new
this house.
friends, his joyful discoveries. Even when he struggled with complicated feelings about his father, Grace met him with honesty and compassion, believing that the messiness of truth was far better than the false calm of denial. "You're brave," she told Oliver one evening, after he confided heartbreak over his classmates' questions. "It takes courage to be honest about how you feel. We can find our way through this together." Oliver nodded, trusting her. That trust, hard-earned, rebuilt brick by brick, solidified the foundation of their new life. With Thomas no longer dominating her days or thoughts, Grace discovered aspects of herself she'd let fade. She wandered through bookstores, picking up novels simply for pleasure. She signed up for a community art class, sketching in charcoal, surprising herself when long, quiet creativity poured out. Her network of friends, once shallow and orbiting around Thomas's world, began to deepen. She gravitated towards those who truly saw her, no longer having time or patience for
Just a box of
artifice.
Dad's old
Her
books.
work with Samantha Lewis and the foundation continued to blossom.
I have
Grace
completed
found
my
fulfillment in
investigation,
mentoring
and the
women,
facts are quite
not
clear.
only those in crisis, but young girls searching for direction
Yes, I saw
and
them.
self-worth. She spoke at workshops and led support circles, sometimes sharing her own story, sometimes simply listening. It was work that reminded her daily of both the scars and the strength that resilience could create. A subtle joy crept into her routines. A walk in Central Park as cherry blossoms fluttered down. Laughter
really
over
just toss
pizza
all this
with
old stuff.
Oliver after a lost soccer match. The quiet pride of a thank you letter from a woman she'd helped. These ordinary glories meant more than any society gala or headline ever had. Late one afternoon, Grace sat alone on her terrace, watching the last rays burnish the city. She reflected, not with anger, but with a gentle acceptance, on the years spent molding herself to fit someone else's expectations. The lesson was clear. If hard won, true strength was not in never stumbling, but in rising again and again, certain of one's integrity, even when the world jeered or doubted. She thought, too, of Thomas. His legal troubles had grown into a long process, and, though it pained her to know Oliver visited him awkwardly under court supervision, she hoped, quietly, without bitterness, that he, too, might someday rediscover the better parts of himself. Grace no longer feared his power. She pitied the emptiness behind his former ambition. Most of all, she refused to let their story define her son's future. One weekend, Grace and Oliver rode the ferry to Staten Island, picnic basket in tow. On the breezy ride, Oliver asked, "Are we happy now, Mom?" The question was earnest, a child's attempt to define what had changed. Grace hugged him close, inhaling the tang of brine and distant possibility. "We are," she promised, "not because everything is perfect, but because we're free to be ourselves and free to love without pretending." The Foundation's first scholarship recipient, a shy young woman named Rosa, sent Grace a note full of gratitude and trembling hope. These ripples, Grace realized, reached beyond her own healing. Every time she spoke up or extended a hand to another, the world shifted, if only slightly, toward compassion. It became her mission to remind others that adversity did not shrink their worth. The more Grace gave, the fuller her own life became. Spring matured into summer. The city gleamed, untamed as ever. Grace and Oliver went camping upstate, built a fire beneath an indigo sky, and whispered secrets in the tent, wrapped in the hush of crickets. For the first time in years, the future felt expansive, not terrifying, but brimming with days waiting to be filled on their own terms. On Oliver's last day of school, he stood on the playground hill, scanning the crowd for her. When their eyes met, his face lit up, proud, trusting, unburdened. Grace waved, her heart swelling with gratitude, and the knowledge that whatever trials lay ahead, this new dawn was truly theirs. As the city lights blinked on that evening, Grace stood at her window once more. She saw not only steel towers and neon, but the reflection of a woman remade. Not perfect or fearless, but resilient and brave. She had faced the darkness, refused to yield to silence, and built, from brokenness, a new story, a story of hope, agency, and truth. Whatever storms returned, Grace knew she would meet them as she was now, standing tall, guided by love, her face turned toward the dawn.